There are two parts to this sermon. There's a short first part where I tell you what I'm not going to talk about. There's a longer second part where I talk about the thing I'm going to talk about. My hope is that by mentioning the first thing, we can focus a bit more on the second thing, and that by speaking about the second thing, we have permission to give adequate voice to the first. Follow me? Okay, here it is. I'm not going to talk about Israel. It's not because I have nothing to say. I do. It's not that I feel Israel shouldn't be discussed from the Bima. It should, and you know I've spoken about Israel, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, from this pulpit many times. No, I speak not about the events of this past week because I am still formulating my thoughts, still trying to fully understand my own feelings. How do I begin to make sense of the violence in Gaza, the violence in Jerusalem, the violence in diverse Jewish Palestinian towns like Akko and Bat Yam, the violence on the West Bank? What can I say about extremist lynch mobs of Jews, of Arabs? How do I characterize the deaths of children and other civilians from rocket attacks, mortar shells, aerial bombardment? How do I reflect on my own family and friends who have had to scatter to the miklat, the communal bomb shelter, or the mamad, the safe room, time and time again, or spend the night there with their kids? What about my cousin Rose, who flew to Israel with her son, Sam, who is a reporter for Haaretz, to see him for his birthday, and her grandchildren, and whose flight was diverted from Tel Aviv to Eilat, and whose bus, while heading north to Beit Shemesh, took a rock to the windshield? And thank God the driver had the presence of mind to stay on the road. How to tell the story of Arna Desser, our congregant, who's visiting her daughter in Beersheba for her granddaughter's bat mitzvah over Shavuot, and how Arna, who still sang Kaddish for her father, Murray Miller, had to jump off our Zoom minyan Wednesday morning abruptly because the siren went off and they needed to head back to the mamad. Do I focus on the pain, the loss, the incessant anxiety for everyone in Israel or Palestine, the geopolitics, who fired first? What about those homes in Sheikh Jarrah or Silwan? What about the settler movement? What about Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the PA and Abu Mazen? What about the breakdown of negotiations between Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, and Mansour Abbas, and what that might mean for Netanyahu for a fifth round of elections? What does all that mean for Israel's democracy, not just in name, but in practice? Israelis use many words to describe the conflict, but one word in particular, matzav, the situation. The bitter irony is that the word matzav is quite similar to the word matseva, which means gravestone. The problem of trying to give a sermon about Israel in the midst of a crisis is that to say anything is to minimize the whole thing, to flatten a fiercely complicated moment wrapped up in a monumentally complex conflict into something far less true. I'm not interested in Torah that's dismissive, Torah that's reductive, or Torah that's platitudinous, or Torah that's politicized to the point of absurdity. Torah of the matzav, when the matzav is raging, becomes Torah of the matzeva, dead Torah. And Torah must always, always be Eitz Chaim Hi, a tree of life. As Kohelet says, there is a time and place for everything. Eit lachashot ve'eit ledaber. There is a time to speak, but first there's a time for silence, not the other way around. So here's what I'd like to do. I want to speak for a short while about something else that happened this week. And I don't mean Liz Cheney or masking policy or cicadas, which keep happening but not happening, or youth vaccinations, though my kids did get vaccinated Thursday, and that's kind of amazing. But before I get to that something else, one last thing about the matzav. Just because I'm not ready to speak on this doesn't mean speaking is unhelpful. I actually think one of the best ways to process our feelings around these terrible events is to talk with one another about them. So rather than my preaching to you about Israel today, I've altered my class for the Come and Learn Tikkun Leil Shavuot this Sunday night to allow for us to talk with one another. So if you wish to share your thoughts, I would very much like to hear them at 9:00 p.m. Sunday on Zoom. Come if you need to talk, but please don't come if you aren't interested in listening too. Come, no matter your perspective, but please don't come if your perspective is so hardened that hearing other perspectives is beyond your grasp. Come if sharing and hearing thoughts and feelings in a Jewish context will add value to your life and the lives of others. Okay, time to start my sermon. Sophie did a beautiful job framing the U.S. Census with regard to our Parsha. This week we received a different set of numbers about this country with the Pew Research Center's long-awaited release of its 2020 survey of Jewish Americans, published May 11th, Miriam's birthday. This is the first comprehensive study of Jews in the U.S. since the 2013 study, and this one employed more effective methodologies to arrive at its finding. Understanding that I'm not a demographer nor a sociologist, though these days I guess I can claim to do whatever I do by playing one on TV. Either way, I hesitate to draw any definitive conclusions about what the data mean, but in the spirit of Parashat Bamidbar, as a pulpit rabbi who cares deeply about American Jewry and most definitely about the success and thriving of our community here at Beth Am, I would like to share some of the Pew Study's highest level findings and humbly suggest some guiding questions and principles for us to consider. Since we were sort of discussing Israel, let's start there. 45% of respondents said caring about Israel is essential to being Jewish, so that's less than half. But not surprisingly, young U.S. Jews are even less emotionally attached to Israel than older ones. As of 2020, about half of Jewish adults under age 30 described themselves as very or somewhat emotionally committed to Israel, compared with 2/3 of Jews ages 65 and older. In addition, for Jews ages 50 and older, half say that caring about Israel is essential to what being Jewish means to them, and an additional 37% say it is important but not essential. Just 10% say caring about Israel is not important to them at all. By contrast, among Jewish adults under 30, 1/3 say caring about Israel is essential, and 1/4 say it's not important to what being Jewish means to them. Two questions come to mind. For someone like me, who for various reasons cares deeply about the state of Israel and the Jewish community there, we might ask what can be done to drive up those numbers. But as a synagogue that also cares deeply about the Jewish people, young and old here in America, and ensuring they feel shuls are places they want to be, an equally important question is how do we avoid making Israel affinity into a litmus test for Jewish affiliation? Perhaps through coming to Beth Am, more people, young and old, might feel more engaged with the project of Medinat Israel, or the destiny and plight of the Jewish people wherever they are, or the destiny and plight of the Palestinian people and the complex dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But perhaps they won't. Perhaps shul life will inspire more trips to Israel, so more people can make educated, on-the-ground assessments of Israel's value in their lives. But maybe not. Are we willing to say that we want you here whether or not Israel is at the forefront of your mind? Whether or not we think it will be? I am. I want you here. By the way, to put Israel affinity stuff in perspective, as I said, 45% of adult Jews overall said Israel is essential to their Jewish identity, but 59% said working for justice or equality in society is essential. That bodes well for Beth Am's mission and values. And 72% said leading an ethical and moral life, also very much in our wheelhouse. And 1/3 of people said having a good sense of humor, which feels a little low to me, but the survey was conducted during the Trump era. And I don't know about you, but that was a pretty humorless time, so who knows? What do you think was the number one issue central to Jewish American identity, both in the 2013 survey and in the one that was just done? Remembering the Holocaust. More than 3/4 of all respondents said that. Which brings me to a bit of bad news, in a sense, not for Jewish identity, but for Jewish safety and security here in America. 75% of those surveyed say they feel there's more anti-Semitism in America than there was 5 years ago. More than half of us say we feel less safe. 42% say we feel about the same. Almost none of us say that we feel safer. Now this could be because 37% say that they've seen anti-Jewish graffiti or vandalism in their local community in the past 12 months, while nearly 20% say they have been made to feel unwelcome because they are Jewish, and 15% say they've been called offensive names. 1/3 of American Jews say that they have heard in their presence anti-Semitic language. I doubt that was the case a decade ago. It was probably not the case 6 years ago. These are uncertain times. And while things at the top have improved with lessening of overt or dog whistle expressions of Jew hatred coming from the White House, there is good reason to assume that the ugliness of Trumpism opened up in America is not going away anytime soon. I often think of the Rashi to Sophie's Devar Torah earlier on the story of Amalek. You remember Amalek is described as the kind of arch nemesis of the Jewish people, and Rashi mentions that the words in Deuteronomy, Asher korcha b'derech, how he chanced upon us on the road, the word korcha, he relates to the word kar, which means cold. And Rashi tells this story about a particular very hot bath, and along comes some guy and he jumps into the bath and he gets scalded. But because he jumps into the bath, he lowers the temperature of the water so that the next person who comes along can get into the bath without much of an adverse effect. This is what Rashi says happened with the Amalekites. They were the first ones to attack us as we were on our way out of Egypt. And yes, they were defeated, but because they did, they opened something up in ugliness that allowed for others to come after them and to do more harm. That's what I worry about in this moment. That's what I think about a lot. This is made all the more sad, I think, because we Jews can't even agree on who is anti-Semitic or what anti-Semitism is or what sort of language and behavior qualifies. There's overlap, to be sure, but in this time of American polarization, the Pew study shows the Jewish community is as divided politically as everyone else in America, with Orthodox Jews hugely favoring the Republican Party and non-Orthodox Jews hugely favoring the Democrats. The silver lining is that we Jews as a people are a courageous and resilient bunch. 2/3 of those who feel less safe say that they have not hesitated to participate in Jewish activities because of whatever safety concerns they do have. About 1/4 of those who feel less safe say they have still hesitated but still participate in Jewish observances and events. And only 1 in 10 Jews say that they feel less safe and also that they hesitated and chose not to participate. That's why I'm not surprised that we had such solid numbers after the Pittsburgh shooting and after Charlottesville. Just as I'm not surprised so many Beth Amers showed up for Black Lives Matter protests despite the risk during the pandemic, because our community understands that weighing risk includes the risk of not showing up, not speaking out, not expressing our civil and democratic rights. Two more areas to touch on briefly. The Jewish community seems to be getting more racially and ethnically diverse. In this new study, roughly 9 in 10 U.S. Jewish adults identify as white non-Hispanic, 92%, while 8% identify with all other categories combined. But among Jewish adults under age 30, 85% identify as white non-Hispanic, while 15% identify with all other categories, including 7% Hispanic, 2% Black non-Hispanic, 6% other or multiple races. That is greater racial and ethnic diversity than the survey finds among Jews ages 50 and older, who are 97% white non-Hispanic. So communities like ours that affirm and celebrate diversity, that value equity and inclusion, are poised to convey more relevance, I think, than communities that don't. Which brings me to my final point here about the numbers from this week. While Jews tend to feel less religious than most Americans, synagogue life, if done well, is attuned to the needs of our people. For example, twice as many respondents say being Jewish is more about ancestry and culture than religion. You might think that means that synagogues are less relevant to American Jews than churches are to Christians. And to a certain extent, the data do bear that out. Only 1 in 10 Jews attend services weekly, as opposed to 1/4 of adult Americans overall. But I would argue this is also a messaging problem to many Jews, because they live in a Christian majority nation, think that affiliating with a synagogue is only about religious faith. But remember that old yarn about the 2 Jews talking in shul? One of them leans over to, Diane's nodding, she's like, yes, I know that one. I've heard you tell that one, Rabbi, right? 2 Jews are, I'm going to do it again anyway. They're sitting in shul, and one leans over to the other, maybe from 6 feet apart, I don't know, and says, hey, Maury, I'm surprised to see you here in shul. I thought you didn't believe in God. And he shouts back, oh, Saul, it's okay. People come to synagogue for different reasons. Take Goldstein over there, right? Goldstein comes to shul to talk to God. I come to synagogue to talk to Goldstein. It's good, no matter how many times I tell it, right? Yes, 40% of Americans say their religious faith provides them some meaning and fulfillment. And yes, half that percentage of Jews say the same. But 61% of Jews say spending time with friends is meaningful and fulfilling. Only 49% of adult Americans overall say that. And 3/4 of Jews say spending time with family is meaningful and fulfilling. What's the takeaway for us? Among other things, if your shul is a place you go with your family, if your shul is a place you go to see your friends, then Beth Am is a place to find meaning and fulfillment. And I would argue that it is. We could say more about multiple portals of entry to synagogue life, and myriad other reasons why people come to the shul that they find meaningful and fulfilling. But for now, I want us to ruminate on what re-entry can mean for us at Beth Am. Our mission and our values align with large numbers of American Jewry. Our community has a reputation of being Hamisha, thoughtful, and committed to the pursuit of justice. On the precipice of our holiday celebrating Matan Torah, the receiving of Torah at Sinai, and approaching a year of increased connectivity, increased humanity, we are ready to receive the gift of Torah, the gift of Judaism once again. As we enter the book of Numbers, the Numbers here tell a story. They describe a situation, a matzav. And it's a matzav without being a matzeva. No tombstone just yet for American Judaism. There is plenty of life in these walls. Life on each and every end of this broadcast. Life in the book that we just put back in the ark. Life in the family that celebrates its simcha today. So even though it's been a rough week, I hope that you can join me in saying l'chaim, to life. Because no matter what week, that's always what it's all about. Shabbat Shalom.